everyone. Welcome to the Rebuild SoCal Zone. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in. The California Water Resources Control Board is renewing the Construction General Permit for stormwater runoff and has released a draft permit for review. Today, we're going to discuss the draft permit release and its potential impact on building and land development. With that, I'd like to welcome today's guests, Mr. Dave Mercier, who is head of the Water Quality Department at Michael Baker International's local office, and Dr. Mark Gray, who is the Principal Technical Director for the Construction Industry Coalition on Water Quality, as well as the Director of Environmental Affairs for the BIA of Southern California. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it. So, Mark, let's jump right in with the first question. What is the Construction General Permit for stormwater, and what impact does that have on contractors and public agencies?
Well, thanks, Marcy, and it's great to be here today. The permit, the Construction General Permit, allows discharge or the release of stormwater runoff during construction phase of a project. The State Water Resources Control Board adopts the Construction General Permit, and it's enforced locally by 9 regional boards that are geographically positioned in California based on watersheds. All building and construction projects in California greater than 1 acre generally must obtain coverage before construction starts. Smaller projects less than 1 acre can trigger permit coverage too if they're part of a common plan of development, like think small subdivision. And the main purpose of the permit is to control and minimize the amount of sediment, the soil, the dirt, suspended in runoff, which leaves a project site. And that has a real sweeping effect in that since just about every construction project in California is covered by it, contractors, project owners have to spend a fair bit of money complying with it, using what's known as best management practices for erosion and sediment control.
Okay, that is a great explanation. Thank you. I appreciate that. Also, what are KICWIC and its member associations doing to impact the permit renewal process?
Well, great. That's a good question. And just so the audience knows, the KICWIC is the Construction Industry Coalition on Water Quality, and we're made up of 5 building and construction industry trade associations in California, 4 of which are located here in Southern California: Associated General Contractors, Engineering Contractors Association, Building Industry Association of Southern California, and the Southern California Contractors Association. And we're also supported by United Contractors in San Ramon up in the Bay Area. And we have been working in collaboration and extensively with a wide range of other construction industry stakeholders and other industry stakeholders, such as Southern California Edison, the gas company, and other public works agencies through CASCA, California Stormwater Quality Association, which represents a lot of municipal and flood district interests in California. And so we, working for our membership, have been engaging at the state level with the staff at the State Water Board, executive management, the board members. I want your audience here to know that the permit was last renewed starting in about 2009. It was adopted, a renewal was adopted in 2012, and our industry has been working extensively with the state since that time in the implementation of the permit. And we've done a great deal of outreach work with them on what works, what doesn't, what changes could actually streamline and improve the permit and achieving water quality objectives. So we have spent a significant amount of time and resources in a collaborative way, because really, to sum up, a complex regulatory action like this requires a team approach and requires a lot of outreach with affected stakeholders, because again, this permit costs project owners a lot of money. I'm talking tens of thousands of dollars each year for your project. So we've had a wide-ranging outreach effort that we've engaged in. And that also includes, I want to mention a couple other the California Building Industry Association, which represents the home builders at the state level, Associated General Contractors of California, their advocacy team in Sacramento, and also our friends down in San Diego BIA, and also the Associated General Contractors as well. So it's really, kind of a blanket team approach to advocating for the construction industry. industry.
That sounds like a really impressive list of stakeholders, and they sound very engaged. So that's really good to hear. So, Dave, maybe you could take this next question. What are the key challenges with the 2021 draft construction general permit? And are there any major areas of concern there?
Sure thing. The changes coming into this 2021 draft are really focused on, we see an overall ramping up of expectations when it comes to implementing these BMPs that Mark introduced as best management practices. The biggest impact we're seeing is the inclusion of how dischargers would need to deal with impaired water bodies. And we refer to those as TMDLs. They have total maximum daily loads assigned to them. And here in Southern California, it's a big focus as we analyze the existing projects that would have been impacted. We see about 10 to 15% in Orange County and San Diego. In LA, we see over 80 or 90% of projects would have been impacted by these new impaired water body requirements. And the cost associated with those challenges could really go up because the different types of pollutants we're talking about are very difficult to remove from stormwater. And so we typically see the type of treatment required for those showing up at a more permanent facility where you're trying to remove a dissolved metal or nutrients from water. To do that on a construction site is just an entirely different use of that technology. And the level of advanced treatment is really increased. And so the TMDL implementation requirements that we see in the permit are really the big thing that have caught our eye. To come along with that, we also see some increased requirements in the amount of sampling that will need to happen. Overall, a general increase in the number of samples that would need to be taken during any specific rain event. We also see a change in the definition of rain events, which should be mostly helpful to dischargers or project owners. There's a defining of that to make sure it's clear when you need to go out during an ongoing rain event, how much rain along with the expected percent of rain. And so that should overall help project owners. And then finally, some changes in the inspection requirements. For the lower risk projects, there might be a few less inspections. Instead of having to be out there weekly, they're proposing you only need to be out there monthly now. And in addition, we kind of see that balanced on the other side by the potential need for oversight when BMP improvements are taking place. And that carries a pretty big cost implication with it. That's a new requirement that, again, just requires additional staff being on site to make sure things are happening. So I think that covers a lot of the big ones, Mark.
Yeah, I don't think you missed anything. I think what I wanted to expand with you, Dave, is in terms of meeting these total maximum daily load requirements, one of the most concerning element of this permit is that the state is proposing that a contractor who's responsible for the runoff or the discharge from your construction site has to meet what's known as a numeric effluent limit under some circumstances. And this is a hard and fast concentration in parts per million or parts per billion. This is a hard and fast concentration that has to be met at the property line. And if you don't meet it, it's an immediate permit violation, a Clean Water Act permit violation, which carries a significant fine and penalty, almost $55,000 a day per occurrence. And that's just the fine, not to mention the legal expense that it would take to defend a contractor from that. The permit also includes numeric action levels as well that don't carry that enforcement standard. If you exceed the number, then you have to take some steps to determine why you exceeded and what you could make improvements upon. We're supportive of that approach, but not the numeric effluent limit. And Dave, maybe talk just a moment or two. The existing permit really emphasizes sediment removal and uses a variety of BMP technologies to do that. I think one of the industry's major concerns is, you just touched on it a bit with your discussion about treatment, but why is that such a problem? We've focused on sediment control. This new permit has expanded the list of pollutants that a contractor has to measure to beyond just sediment through a turbidity measurement, which can be done in the field by just about any trained staff and personnel. This new approach requires sampling, taking it to a laboratory, getting results, reporting them back. Practically speaking, seems like a big problem. What are your thoughts on
Yeah, and that is the change, is that in the current permit, we're focused on, if we need to go out and do monitoring, typically it's for pH and turbidity. You can do both of those things in the field. Turbidity is measuring roughly the amount of sediment you're discharging of fine sediment. And so this expands beyond that. These TMDLs, these water quality impairments, the state board, who's the regulator putting out this permit, has felt the need to include those in there. And rather than just having your simple handheld meter and being able to really make adjustments on the fly, that is the value of having this field test for turbidity. You can recognize when there's a challenge in your BMP implementation and try to make improvements during the storm. As we move to these other constituents, so the metals, pesticides, nutrients, all these different focus that are being added now, what you have to do is partner with a laboratory. You get a set of bottles that you need to collect samples in. During the event, you need to ship them off to the lab. And I commented on the increased number of sampling that's going to be needed. So for each discharge point now, we're looking at 3 samples. If you have multiple discharge points, you can imagine how many samples that starts to grow to. And each set of those samples for some of these different pollutants is going to start running into the hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And you start to multiply that out by the 3 sets of those per location, multiple locations. Just the ability to pull that off, collect all those samples in the allotted time is going to increase the amount of labor. And, really we start to go back and tie everything to water quality. In the end, we all care about what's getting into our receiving waters, getting to the ocean, but are the actions that are being requested here really leading to that ultimate improvement of water quality? And that's where we have some challenges. And if we do need to provide treatment, it's incredibly unclear right now whether the technology exists to really hit the numbers that are being included. And without that confidence that if the investment is made to try to treat the runoff, that you can get to those numbers, it's really asking a lot for a project owner to make that level of investment without knowing that they're going to get that outcome.
Right. And just so folks on the podcast know, currently in California, you can use what are known as advanced sediment treatment systems in very sensitive situations. When I say sensitive water bodies, maybe a sensitive lagoon in a coastal situation, a sensitive salmon spawning stream in the North Coast, other locations. Advanced sediment treatment's available. And that focuses on sediment. The challenge we have as an industry is in this draft permit, it's these other pollutants that we have to treat for, that treatment systems just aren't available. You mentioned costs, and I want the audience to know Dave and his group at Michael Baker International have done an extensive cost analysis of the permit impact on 6 different types of construction projects, ranging from housing, schools, public works, large transportation, that encounter these total maximum daily load requirements, that encounter these ramped up sampling situations. Dave, maybe talk a little bit about that cost estimate, and then also maybe fold in a lot of these. You'd have to use advanced sediment treatment to attempt to meet the number, but then there's even no assurance that you'll meet that other pollutant number, not the sediment number. So maybe run through that for the audience a little bit and kind of tell us about your findings, which I think that people are going to really be interested in.
You got it. So as Mark shared, we looked at a handful of scenarios ranging from everything, as he described, to a large land development and home building operation that maybe spans dozens of acres, all the way down to maybe just a 1 or 2 acre commercial or educational development site, maybe a linear transportation project at the county level. And on the front end, we see an increase in SWIP development costs. So this is the document that lays out the plan, maybe ranging in there anywhere from 10 to 30%. And we can come back and talk about the magnitude of these beyond just the percentage increase. Next, we looked at the amount of monitoring that would be required. And so this is who's going out to the site every week, whether, what level of experience and training that person has, and how often they need to be doing it. And there it ranges quite widely. At the lower risk levels, risk level 1, we're maybe only a 10% increase in cost. But as you move into the higher risk levels, and we would expect a lot more projects to be in these upper risk levels now that the new TMDL requirements come into effect, there we start to see maybe a 30 to 50% increase in cost. And next we looked at the minimum BMPs. So these are the different controls you would put out on a construction site. When we look at the minimum level, those are probably going to stay the same, maybe a slight uptick up to 5% or so. And then we tried to account for the implementation of the TMDL requirements. And this is where you would need to either be including a whole lot more erosion and sediment control or adding in some of these advanced treatment systems. And there we don't have a good percentage cost increase because it wasn't a previous requirement. So we can just talk raw numbers. But overall, as we look at projects, if you are not in a TMDL watershed, not much of an impact there, maybe up to 10%. But it's those projects that end up in a TMDL watershed where we really start to see some big numbers kick in. And so when we look at more raw dollars, the level we're looking at is probably in the tens to up to the hundreds or even into the millions of dollars of difference in change. And so if we look at a home development, land development, home building project per se, we assumed a 4-year construction duration. And typically that would have cost, or based on our estimates from what we've seen over the past decade here, that might have cost about $1 million on the construction stormwater permit implementation costs. What we're projecting now for having to deal with these TMDL requirements, implement additional BMPs, do more monitoring, you're up close to $3 million. And so estimated difference in there over the course of a 4-year project was about $1.6 million, 150% increase. Again, a lot of this is estimates. We're using our experience over the past decade of implementing this permit, and we're having to make some assumptions about what it looks like when people need to try to address these pollutants. That cost at about 150%, I would admit could be lower, could also be much higher depending on how many discharge points you have and how many of these treatment systems you might need to implement. And as we look out through the range, we had projects that we projected up to 180% of what their previous cost would have been, and all the way down to, I'll say, just 50% increase. Still looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars of impact. And again, the thing we want to get out of this is, if we're doing more, can we see a direct tie-in to water quality improvement? And with the temporary nature of these construction projects, we're just not convinced that the cost increase and impact, is met with that same water quality benefit.
And Marcy, for the audience, I mean, that's our biggest, concern is that this proposal is pushing contractors and owners towards installing and using systems that A, are much more costly than currently used, and B, really won't impact water quality improvement that much.
Right.
Our concern is sediment and always has been, and that's what we should emphasize. And that's what contractors are used to using, physical controls. Not to say that some construction projects shouldn't be using advanced sediment treatment systems. Some should. The project location dictates it, the sensitivity, right? That we're not saying no to that, because that's already in the existing permit. But the major concern to the industry is that all this cost and time and effort, and not only is it meeting the number, it's all the labor and the ancillary costs, the laboratory costs, the collection, the consulting time.
And just the time.
Just the time alone. Right. So the other thing the audience needs to know is the legal liability with that. It creates tremendous legal liability, which is a cost that's hard for a project to bear. And something we've learned, Dave, and you've heard this in us working together on this project, we've heard this from the big contractors in California, from Granite, from Tykert, the big folks. These numeric effluent limits are scary to them because it may prevent them from bidding on projects.
I was just going to say that.
Because they're worried and concerned about getting in the legal entanglement. Mm-hmm. So this is a disincentive, really a regulatory disincentive, and it'll just increase construction costs because you'll have less bidders on a construction project.
Actually just took the words right out of my mouth. I was just going to say it sounds like so many extra unneeded steps for not only the small contractors, but for the large contractors. and
That-
what it's going to do, like you just said, to the bidding process for these projects is going to be
It makes the
scary.
bidding really difficult. And you mentioned
Yeah.
the small contractor and the large contractor. So on the large contractor side, it's a disincentive, and small, it's a disincentive to bid on projects. On the small contractor side, a lot of folks, Dave's in the business of helping our members, helping public agencies, but the way this permit's going, the sophistication is so high that a lot of these smaller contractors don't have the sophistication to do this. And they've got to hire a Dave Mercier at Michael Baker International, or someone, a qualified consulting firm to help do those sorts of things. It just drives cost up with no clear benefit, no benefit to water quality. Dave, I wanted to ask you on your cost estimates. You looked at 6 different types of projects, right?
Correct.
From housing to transportation. Do you see private versus public any real difference, or is it more geographically driven, the cost with complying with TMDLs and numeric effluent limits? Is there any, just for because some contractors on this who listen to the podcast do public works, others do housing, private, any difference there? Or?
Yeah, I don't know if we see a real clear trend along those lines. It's really going to be driven by where your project is. And that hits in 2 ways. Traditionally, it's been, where is your project? What are your soils like? What is your topography like? That's going to drive the challenges. Now you're really going to want to be aware, does this project site sit within one of these TMDL watersheds? Because understanding what the expectation is going to be in terms of treatment of that discharge is going to drive what types of advanced treatment or not you might not need. And that's really going to be the kicker. How long is the project? How many wet seasons are you looking at? And what that location is going to be more.
Yeah, that location and specificity is important. Something I wanted to add, if I could, we have the Casca Training Committee sub-chair with us here, Dave Mercier.
Right.
And if I'm a contractor and I'm listening to this podcast, I'm thinking, good Lord, my guys and gals know how to swing hammers and run power nailers and install concrete. I'm going to have to train all these people for stormwater. There's an existing training program known as Qualified SWIP Practitioner. And SWIP, again, for the audience, is Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. That's your document of how you're going to manage your stormwater on your construction site. And there's a Qualified SWIP Practitioner, the person who implements that in the field, and a Qualified SWIP developer who writes the document and then has to sort of manage the implementation of it, which means what best management practices get put in the field and how the inspections proceed. And when they do that, training requirements for this, Dave, I mean, it looks like there's going to be a lot of retraining required, or continuing education and training. That seems like a cost for owners and contractors. Thoughts on training?
Yeah, if you have your own QSD and QSP on staff and you handle this in-house rather than subbing it out, then there certainly will be. I'm on the construction general permit training team as well. CASCA, the California Stormwater Quality Association, administers that program, provides the testing and everything for the QSD and QSP program. I don't know that it's going to be an entire recertification, but if you do have staff like that on your teams, you are going to want to get them trained and familiar with this. And that certainly will be an investment in time and energy to make sure that everybody's aware of what these new requirements are. While we do have a good deal of continuity from the 2009 permit into this draft, the changes that have been made are key and essential to understand, not just in the when is monitoring needed, how have inspections changed, some of those pieces, but really understanding how these TMDL requirements would impact your project site. Or another change that we didn't touch on before was the inclusion of passive treatment.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. The
ability to use chemicals on site, not in an active way, the way we've talked about some of these advanced treatment systems where a computer is likely running the dosing. But here, the ability to introduce polyacrylamide as one of the more well-known chemicals that we might use to help fine particle sediments come together, stick together better, fall out of runoff before it's discharged. And so having a tool like that is wonderful. It's something we've asked the state board for a long time. We're hopeful it's going to make it all the way through and be something we could use. But that's another example of a place where we've got to change to the permit, and there would be some need for some education in order to take full advantage.
Right. And I knew that area, the inclusion of passive sediment treatment was again, for the podcast audience, was a concern of our industries. It's a useful tool, but when not used correctly, when not used appropriately, it can actually become a problem and a liability. Yeah. So our membership, the membership of Kickwick and the industry funds here, is going to have to get up to speed with that new requirement in the permit, and if you're going to consider using it.
Certainly.
So another real important area.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. You guys are both definitely a wealth of information. I'm sure that our audience has learned a lot from you guys today. And before we close this segment, is there anything else that you think our audience should know, or anything that maybe our listening audience could help do, with these new regulations coming?
Well, I think we've talked about it a little bit before, and I just want to reemphasize to the listening audience that I see this in my work throughout California on water quality regulatory actions. These permits that the state is implementing are starting to move beyond especially the monitoring requirements are moving beyond the core concern. And here, for instance, the core concern is sediment runoff. We're moving into testing a lot of other pollutants in the environment for the sake of knowledge, for the sake of so-called complying with total maximum daily loads, but yet divert our attention away from the core requirement. And we see that in other permits. So the listening audience, I would be paying attention to that for your other types of permits that you're involved in California, and how the sort of the mission creep of the intent of that permit. The other thing I want to emphasize to the audience that we've talked about is the cost impact of this is going to be big. And so how do you get involved? And how do you have a voice in this? Well, number one, you need to be involved with your trade associations,
right,
that represent you. So, and I mentioned the names of them. I work for Building Industry Association of Southern California. So we do a really, I think, strong job informing our membership, getting them involved as members, having them, and as you as a member, voicing that to the regulators themselves during comment periods, working with us to form our advocacy and our technical basis. That's why folks like Dave Mercier help us, because they also work for our members. Many of our home builder members use Michael Baker International. That's a really key way to get involved at this level, is get involved with your association.
Great. Thank you. Dave, do you have anything else you'd like to close with?
Let's see. These regulations aren't going away.
This good. Thanks for the reality check. Right.
These permits are supposed to renew every 5 years. As we see, sometimes they run longer. But there will be another construction general permit after this, and we do need to work within the bounds of them. I think, as I've mentioned previously, for us, we care about water quality. We want to make sure that construction sites are managing the discharge of pollutants when it happens, as well as they can. But when these investments are being made, we just really want to make sure that there is a clear tie to improving water quality. And as Mark said, we don't start to lose focus on what really the key is. And in this case, from a temporary construction site, we want to make sure sediment isn't doing long-term damage downstream.
Exactly.
And so if investments being made, what's the water quality improvement? Can we directly tie those together? And from there, we just need to implement those strategies the best we can.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Dave. We appreciate you being with us today and sharing all of your knowledge. And
have a great afternoon.
Glad to join
have
you.
a great afternoon. Thank you for listening, everyone. Please be sure to subscribe and join us again in 2 weeks for another new episode of the Rebuild SoCal Zone.